I grew up in a small town in Montana, one of those places where everyone knows your name and your business. Our town was flanked by thick, dark woods, the kind of forest that seemed alive, filled with secrets it wasn't willing to share. Life there was simple, quiet, and predictable, until the summer of 2007. I had just graduated high school and was working part-time at the town's only grocery store, saving up for college. My evenings were spent hanging out with my best friends, Rachel and Jake, either at the local diner or driving aimlessly around town. But one night, a decision to explore those woods changed everything. It started with Rachel's idea to visit the old abandoned train depot hidden deep in the woods. The depot had been in use for decades, and rumors of hauntings surrounded it. Kids dared each other to go there, but few actually did. Rachel, ever the thrill seeker, was convinced we'd find something cool. "Come on," she urged as we stood on the edge of the woods, flashlights in hand. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake and I reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the narrow dirt path. The air was cool, the towering pines blocking out what little moonlight there was. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, we found the depot. It was a crumbling two-story building with broken windows and a sagging roof. Rusting train cars sat on the tracks nearby, their hulking forms casting eerie shadows. As we approached, a strange unease settled over me, like we were being watched. Rachel was the first to enter, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Jake and I followed hesitantly, the wooden floor creaking under our weight. The air inside was musty, heavy with the scent of decay. Graffiti covered the walls, and old train schedules lay scattered across the floor. "This is so creepy," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. We wandered through the depot, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the oppressive darkness. It was the sensation of being observed. Then we heard it, a soft scraping sound, like metal against concrete, coming from somewhere upstairs. We froze, our flashlights darting toward the staircase at the far end of the room. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, though his voice wavered. Rachel, undeterred, started up the stairs. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. We followed her, the stairs groaning under our weight. At the top, we found a long hallway lined with doors, most of them hanging off their hinges. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, from the room at the end of the hall. We approached cautiously, our flashlights trembling in our hands. As we neared the door, I noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols carved into the wood, like some kind of ritualistic writing. My stomach churned, and I wanted to leave, but Rachel pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old metal chair lying on its side in the middle of the floor. A faint metallic smell hung in the air, and the walls were covered in more of those strange symbols. "What the hell is this?" Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Before any of us could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. Panic set in as we scrambled to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. Then the scraping sound returned, this time directly above us. We looked up to see a series of holes in the ceiling, through which something was moving, something large and deliberate. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked, and the chair slid across the room as if pushed by an unseen force. Rachel screamed, and we all bolted for the door, pounding on it in desperation. After what felt like an eternity, it finally gave way, and we stumbled back into the hallway. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air a welcome relief. But the forest felt different now, darker, more menacing. The sense of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. As we made our way back to the car, we realized we weren't alone. Shadows moved between the trees, keeping pace with us. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their faces obscured by darkness. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating. We broke into a sprint, the path twisting and turning in the dark. The figures followed, their movements unnaturally fluid. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded as we finally reached the car. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, and Jake started the engine. As we sped away, I looked back and saw them standing at the edge of the woods, their dark silhouettes illuminated by the taillights. One of them raised a hand, as if waving goodbye. We didn't talk about that night for a long time. Rachel insisted we'd imagined it, that the darkness and our own fear had gotten the better of us. But I couldn't forget the symbols on the walls, or the way the chair had moved on its own. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods was still watching. Years later, I heard rumors of other strange occurrences near the depot. Disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, even stories of people hearing whispers in the trees. I don't know what's out there, but I know I'll never go back to find out. Growing up in a small, sleepy town in Pennsylvania, I always thought of our community as safe, boring even. Nothing exciting ever happened there. No major crimes, no strange occurrences, just the same day-to-day rhythm of life. But everything changed one autumn night in 2009, when I learned that even the most mundane towns can hide dark secrets. At the heart of our town was St. Mary's Church, a tall, Gothic structure that had stood for over a century. Its bell tower loomed over Main Street, a constant, silent sentinel. The bell hadn't rung in years, and no one ever went up there. There were rumors, of course, whispers about a tragedy that had occurred decades ago, but no one seemed to know the full story. That night, my friends Evan, Sarah, and I decided to explore the bell tower. It wasn't my idea. Evan, ever the daredevil, thought it would be fun to sneak into the church and see what was up there. Sarah and I were hesitant, but his enthusiasm was infectious. Besides, it wasn't like we had anything better to do. We met outside the church at midnight, flashlights in hand. The air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched underfoot as we crept toward the side door. Evan had managed to snag the key. Don't ask me how, and we slipped inside, the heavy wooden door groaning as it shut behind us. The interior of the church was dark and eerily quiet, the faint smell of incense lingering in the air. Our footsteps echoed as we made our way to the staircase that led to the bell tower. The door at the base of the stairs was old and warped, the paint peeling away to reveal the wood beneath. It creaked loudly as Evan pushed it open. The staircase was narrow and steep, spiraling upward into darkness. The air grew colder as we ascended, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and kept climbing, my flashlight beam bouncing off the stone walls. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in a small, circular room with large, arched windows that overlooked the town. The bell itself hung in the center, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was massive, its surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer in the light of our flashlights. "This is awesome," Evan said, grinning as he approached the bell. He ran his hand along its surface, brushing away the dust. "Can you imagine how loud this thing would be?" Sarah and I weren't as enthusiastic. The room felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and there was a strange smell, metallic, like blood. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder to breathe. "Guys, let's go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I don't like it up here." Evan waved her off, but before he could respond, we heard it. A low, guttural groan. The sound seemed to come from the bell itself, vibrating through the floor and walls. Evan froze, his hand still on the bell, as Sarah and I backed toward the staircase. The groan grew louder, deeper, until it became a deafening roar that filled the room. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We stood there in stunned silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. Evan took a step back from the bell, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before any of us could answer, the room was plunged into darkness. Our flashlights flickered and went out, leaving us blind in the pitch-black tower. Panic set in as we scrambled to turn them back on, but the buttons wouldn't work. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from somewhere below us. Slow, deliberate, echoing up the staircase. My heart pounded as the sound grew louder, closer. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Who's there?" Evan shouted, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, came a whisper. a voice low and raspy, speaking words I couldn't understand. It sent chills down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her toward the stairs. Evan followed, his bravado gone. We stumbled down the narrow staircase, our footsteps clattering against the stone. The whispering grew louder, turning into a guttural chant that echoed all around us. When we reached the base of the stairs, we slammed the door shut behind us and ran for the exit. The church seemed darker now, the shadows longer and more menacing. As we reached the front door, I glanced back and saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing at the top of the staircase was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing red eyes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. I turned and ran, bursting out into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we were halfway across town. Only then did we realize that Evan wasn't with us. Panic set in as we debated whether to go back, but before we could decide, he appeared, stumbling out of the darkness. He was pale and shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw it," he muttered, his voice barely audible. It was in the bell. Evan never talked about what he saw that night, and neither did we. But the next morning, the entire town was talking about the church. The bell had rung for the first time in decades, echoing across the town at exactly 3 a.m. No one could explain it, and the pastor swore he hadn't been in the church. The door to the bell tower was found wide open, and the symbols we'd seen carved into the walls had been burned into the wood. To this day, I can't hear the sound of church bells without feeling a pang of fear. Whatever was in that tower wasn't meant to be disturbed, and now I fear it's awake. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire where life moved at a snail's pace. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. Our neighborhood was quiet, with rows of modest homes and well-manicured lawns, and nothing ever seemed out of place. But as I'd come to learn, appearances can be deceiving. The house next door to ours belonged to Mr. Langley, an older man who lived alone. He was polite but distant, keeping to himself most of the time. He rarely left his house, except to tend his garden or get groceries. My parents always said he was just a private person, but as a curious teenager, I couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the closed doors. It wasn't until the summer of 2008 that I started noticing odd things about him. It began with the noises, soft thumps and scraping sounds coming from his basement late at night. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was working on a project or moving furniture. But the noises became more frequent and irregular, always happening between midnight and 3 a.m. My bedroom window faced his house, and some nights I'd sit in the dark, straining to hear what he was doing. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed and peered through the blinds. Mr. Langley's house was dark, except for a faint light glowing from his basement window. I couldn't see much, but I caught glimpses of movement, a shadow pacing back and forth, pausing occasionally as if listening. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to my parents, but they brushed it off. "He's an old man," my dad said. "Probably just can't sleep." A week later, my friends Sarah and Mike came over for a sleepover. We were bored and decided to entertain ourselves by spying on Mr. Langley. It was childish, I know, but we were teenagers looking for a thrill. Around midnight, we set up camp in my bedroom, armed with snacks and flashlights. We waited, whispering and giggling, until the familiar noises started. Thump, scrape, thump. We froze, listening as the sounds grew louder. "Let's get closer," Mike suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I was hesitant, but Sarah and Mike were insistent. We sneaked out of the house and crept toward Mr. Langley's backyard, hiding behind the bushes near his basement window. The light was on again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. "What do you think he's doing?" Sarah whispered. "Probably some weird old man stuff," Mike joked, though his voice was tinged with nervousness. Suddenly, the shadow in the basement stopped moving. We held our breath as a new sound emerged, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was tapping their fingers on a table. It sent chills down my spine. Then, The shadow moved toward the window. We ducked lower, hearts racing, as the shadow loomed larger. It paused, and for a moment, I thought it had spotted us. But then it retreated, and the light flickered off. We stayed hidden for a few minutes, too scared to move, before finally creeping back to my house. That night, none of us slept. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I told Sarah and Mike that I wanted to confront Mr. Langley, but they thought I was crazy. "What are you going to do?" Mike asked. "Knock on his door and accuse him of being creepy?" "No," I said, though the idea was tempting. "But I'm going to find out what he's hiding." Over the next few days, I kept a closer watch on Mr. Langley. I noticed small, strange things. The way he checked his surroundings before leaving the house, the way he never spoke to anyone for more than a few seconds, and the way he carried heavy, covered boxes to his backyard late at night. One evening, while my parents were out, I mustered the courage to investigate. I told myself I'd just take a quick peek in his backyard and leave. Armed with a flashlight, I slipped through the fence and crouched behind the bushes. The backyard was eerily quiet, the faint scent of freshly turned soil hanging in the air. I noticed several patches of disturbed earth near the back fence, like something had been buried recently. As I moved closer, the flashlight beam caught on something shiny sticking out of the dirt. I reached for it, my heart pounding, and unearthed a small, rusted locket. It was old, with intricate designs etched into the metal, and it didn't look like it belonged to Mr. Langley. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Mr. Langley stood at the edge of the yard, his face obscured by shadows. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. I lost my ball," I stammered, my mind racing for an excuse. He stepped closer, and I could see his eyes glinting in the flashlight beam. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Go home." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted through the fence and back to my house, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. Clutching the locket, I knew I couldn't let this go. The next day, I took the locket to the local antique store, hoping to find out more about it. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Hodge, examined it closely. "This is Victorian," she said. "Very old. Where did you find it?" "Just in the woods," I lied. Her face darkened. "This belonged to someone, likely a young woman." There were stories about disappearances back then, especially in isolated towns like ours. Her words sent a chill through me. Was Mr. Langley connected to those disappearances? Was he hiding more in his backyard? I wanted to go to the police, but I had no proof, just a locket and a bad feeling. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. Mr. Langley stopped carrying boxes to the backyard, and the light in the basement stayed off. A month later, he moved out of town without a word. To this day, I don't know what he was doing or what I stumbled upon in his backyard. But every time I see an old locket, I can't help but wonder how many more secrets are buried in the quiet corners of small towns like mine. Secrets that may never see the light of day. I grew up in a small Appalachian town in West Virginia, surrounded by dense forests and winding mountain trails. It was a quiet, sleepy place where most people spent their lives fishing, hunting, and taking long walks through the woods. But the one trail no one ever walked was the old miner's path up Pine Ridge. The path was abandoned decades ago after a series of accidents at the mine it led to. Local folklore claimed the land was cursed, and people whispered about strange occurrences in the area. Vanishing hikers, eerie lights, and disembodied voices. My parents always warned me to stay away, but as a rebellious 17-year-old, I didn't take the stories seriously. That summer, my best friend Emma convinced me and our other friend Tyler to hike the trail. Emma was an amateur photographer and wanted to capture the haunted atmosphere for a school project. Tyler and I were skeptical but agreed. It was just a trail, after all. How bad could it be? We started early on a crisp, cloudy morning. The trailhead was marked by a weathered sign, its letters faded and partially obscured by moss. Danger, trail closed. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. The air felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The path was narrow and overgrown, winding steeply up the ridge. Emma snapped pictures as we walked, her camera clicking steadily. Tyler made jokes to lighten the mood, but even he seemed uneasy. The deeper we went, the darker the forest became, the canopy above blocking out most of the light. About an hour in, we came across the first strange sight, a rusted mining cart half buried in the undergrowth. It looked ancient, its metal warped and covered in moss. Emma was thrilled, snapping close-ups while Tyler and I poked around. That's when we noticed the footprints. They were large, barefoot, and impossibly deep in the soft earth. They didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen, and they were fresh. Probably just some weirdo living out here, Tyler said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma was fascinated. Let's follow them. Reluctantly, we did. The footprints led us off the main trail, deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. I started to regret coming, but Emma was determined, her camera still clicking away. After about 20 minutes, the footprints disappeared. We found ourselves in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. In the center was a stone well, its edges crumbling with age. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it. Something about the well felt wrong, as if it didn't belong. Emma peered inside, her camera poised. "It's just a well," she said, her voice echoing faintly, probably left over from the miners. But when Tyler shone his flashlight down the shaft, the beam didn't reach the bottom. Instead, it reflected off something metallic, far below. We decided to lower Emma's camera into the well, using her camera strap as a makeshift rope. She set the timer and carefully lowered it, her hands trembling slightly. When she pulled it back up, we crowded around the display to see what it had captured. The first few shots showed nothing but stone walls, but the last image was different. It was blurry, as if something had moved quickly in front of the lens. In the center of the frame was a hand, large, pale, and inhuman. We stared at the image in stunned silence. "It's probably a trick of the light," Emma said, though her voice shook. "We need to leave," I said, my gut telling me something was very wrong. As we turned to head back, the forest seemed to shift. The trail we'd followed was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth. The trees pressed in around us, their branches creaking ominously. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. Tyler pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. Emma's compass spun erratically, refusing to settle. We argued about which direction to go, but nothing looked familiar. It was as if the forest had swallowed the trail. Then we heard the sound, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, accompanied by the crunch of leaves and snapping branches. We huddled together, our flashlights darting around the clearing. Something was circling us. I caught a glimpse of it first, a shadow, large and hunched, moving between the trees. Tyler saw it next, his face pale as he gripped a fallen branch like a weapon. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The growling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the shadows, came a voice, low and raspy, speaking words I couldn't understand. It sent chills down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. Without thinking, we bolted in the direction we thought was the trail. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows shifting and twisting as if alive. The growling returned, louder and more guttural, and I knew whatever was following us wasn't far behind. We finally stumbled onto the main trail, our legs burning and lungs heaving. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead, collapsing onto the gravel parking lot. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Emma checked her camera, but the images were gone. The photos from the well, the footprints, even the rusted mining cart, all of them had been erased. Her camera's memory card was completely blank. We never spoke about what happened that day. Emma abandoned her photography project, and Tyler refused to set foot in the woods again. I tried to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those woods had been watching us, waiting for us to make a wrong move. Years later, I heard about a hiker who disappeared on Pine Ridge. Search teams found no trace of him, only a faint trail of footprints leading to the clearing with the well. They never found the bottom. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. Small towns have their quirks, peculiar stories, lingering legends, and shadows that seem to stretch longer than they should. Mine was no exception. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Hills, Clear Hollow was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It was quiet, picturesque, and utterly unremarkable until the fog came. It started one crisp October evening. The air was cool, and the streets were lined with fallen leaves. The town's annual harvest festival had just concluded, and people were returning home from the park. By the time I arrived at my family's house, the fog had begun to roll in. At first, it seemed ordinary, the way fog often does. Soft tendrils curling around streetlights, blanketing the world in an eerie stillness. But as the hours passed, it thickened, swallowing everything in its path. By midnight, the town was invisible, shrouded in a white haze so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The next morning, Clear Hollow woke to a mystery. The fog hadn't lifted. It lingered, heavy and oppressive, turning day into twilight. The local radio station reported nothing unusual, brushing it off as a weather anomaly. But the mood in town shifted. People grew uneasy, locking their doors earlier than usual, whispering about the fog as though it were alive. By the third day, things had gotten strange. A friend of mine, Rachel, vanished while walking home from the diner where she worked. She lived just a block away, but she never arrived. Her parents called everyone they knew, organizing a search party, but the fog swallowed their flashlights and muffled their voices. We found her purse near the corner of Maple Street. Nothing else. The town rallied, but the unease was palpable. People began hearing things. Whispers carried on the breeze, faint and indistinct. Some claimed they saw figures moving in the fog, dark silhouettes that dissolved when approached. Others swore the fog was colder in certain spots, as though something unseen were standing there, watching. On the fifth night, I decided to find out for myself. Armed with a flashlight and a stubborn sense of curiosity, I ventured into the streets, the damp chill clinging to my skin. The fog pressed close, swallowing the world until it felt like I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. That's when I heard it. The whispering was faint at first, a soft susurration like leaves rustling in the wind. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and I realized they weren't random. They were words, my name, repeated over and over. Anna, Anna. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Who's there? I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Then, from the fog, a figure emerged. It was Rachel, or at least it looked like her. She stood a few feet away, her form hazy and indistinct, her eyes wide and unblinking. Anna, she said, her voice soft and echoing strangely. Help me. I took a step forward, but something stopped me. The air around her shimmered, rippling like heat waves, and the temperature dropped sharply. Instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. They're here. Before I could respond, something pulled her back into the fog. It happened so fast I almost doubted I'd seen it. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, and the fog swirled violently where she'd stood. I turned and ran, the whispering rising around me like a chorus of voices, each one calling my name. When I reached my house, I bolted the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. My parents were asleep, blissfully unaware of what was happening outside. I wanted to wake them, to tell them everything, but I couldn't. They'd never believe me. The next morning, the fog was gone. Clear Hollow looked normal again, as though nothing had happened. But Rachel was still missing, and whispers of what I'd seen spread through town. Others came forward with similar stories. Encounters with figures in the fog, strange voices, a creeping sense of being watched. The town tried to move on, but something had changed. The fog had left its mark, and the whispers never truly stopped. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear my name on the wind, faint and distant, a reminder that Clear Hollow will never be the same. I grew up in a small town called Hollow Pines, surrounded by dense, ancient forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew the woods were off limits after dark, not because of bears or other wildlife, but because of something far older and far more terrifying. The stories varied depending on who you asked. Some said the woods were haunted by the spirits of loggers who died there centuries ago. Others believed it was cursed land, untouched by modernity for a reason. My grandfather used to tell me about the Silent Ones, figures that roamed the woods at night, stealing voices and leaving only silence in their wake. I never believed the tales, until the night we decided to test them. It was early November, just after my 18th birthday. My friends Jake and Lisa had come over to hang out, and the conversation drifted to the woods. Jake, ever the skeptic, scoffed at the stories. "Come on, they're just trying to scare kids," he said. "There's nothing out there." Lisa was more cautious. "What about the hikers who went missing last year?" she asked. "Or Mr. Harlan's dog that came back deaf?" "Coincidence," Jake replied. "Let's go see for ourselves." I hesitated, but Jake was relentless. "Just for an hour," he said. "We'll stick to the main trail. What's the worst that could happen?" We set out just after 10 p.m., armed with flashlights and a sense of misplaced bravado. The air was cold, and a light mist hung low over the ground. The trees towered above us, their branches gnarled and bare, clawing at the night sky. At first, the woods were eerily quiet, the only sound our footsteps crunching through fallen leaves. The deeper we went, the more the silence seemed to press in around us, thick and unnatural. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. "See?" Jake said, his voice loud in the stillness. "Nothing to be afraid of." But Lisa wasn't convinced. "Why is it so quiet?" she whispered. "There should be crickets, owls, something." I had no answer. The silence was oppressive, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. About 30 minutes in, we came across a clearing. In the center stood an old, moss-covered well, its stones crumbling with age. Lisa stopped, her flashlight beam fixed on the well. "This wasn't on the map," she said, her voice tinged with unease. Jake shrugged. "It's just a well, probably from when people lived out here." But something about it felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and I thought I could hear a faint humming sound coming from the darkness below. Lisa must have heard it too, because she backed away, her face pale. "Let's go back," she said. "I don't like this." Jake rolled his eyes. "You're scared of a well?" Before we could stop him, he leaned over the edge and shouted, "Hello!" The humming stopped. For a moment, the woods were deathly silent. Then, from the darkness of the well, came a sound, a low, guttural whisper, like dozens of voices speaking at once. It sent chills down my spine, and Lisa grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she said urgently. "Now." Jake hesitated, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent, and even he started to look nervous. We turned and headed back the way we came, our pace quickening with every step. But the woods seemed different now, the trees closer together, the mist thicker. The path we'd followed was gone. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. The whispering followed us, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't random. It was saying our names over and over, in a slow, chilling chant. I could feel eyes on us, though every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Then we saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, standing between the trees. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open as though screaming, but no sound came out. They didn't move, just stood there, watching us. Lisa screamed, and we broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth in a blind panic. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered. Their empty eyes burned into my mind. After what felt like hours, we stumbled out of the woods and into a field near my house. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, the silence of the woods finally broken by the distant sounds of civilization. We never talked about what happened that night. Jake stopped coming around as much, and Lisa refused to go near the woods again. I tried to convince myself it was just our imaginations, but deep down, I knew better. The woods of hollow pines weren't empty, and they weren't silent. The summer of 2014 was one of the stormiest I could remember. Torrential rains turned the dirt roads of our small town into muddy rivers, and the constant thunder made it hard to sleep. Our town, nestled in the flat expanse of Kansas, wasn't known for much other than its predictability. But that summer, something happened that shattered the illusion of safety forever. I was 16 at the time, spending most of my summer working at my uncle's gas station on the edge of town. It was a small, run-down place that catered mostly to truckers and travelers passing through. On stormy nights, it was even quieter than usual, with only the occasional customer braving the weather. One such night, I was working the late shift when the storm rolled in. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the building. The power flickered a few times, but the station's old generator kept the lights on. Around midnight, a man walked in. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his thin frame. He wore a dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He didn't say a word, just stood there dripping onto the floor, his presence unsettling. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly to the back of the store, his boots squelching with every step. I watched as he stopped in front of the cooler, staring at the rows of drinks but not taking anything. Something about him didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he moved, too deliberate, or the way the air seemed colder where he stood. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to cleaning the counter. A minute later, he was gone. I didn't hear the door open or the bell ring. One moment he was there, and the next, the store was empty. The puddle where he'd been standing was still there, but there were no footprints leading to the door. I stepped outside, the rain drenching me instantly. The parking lot was empty, the surrounding fields dark and silent. No car, no lights, nothing to indicate where the man had gone. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night, I was working again when the storm returned, even fiercer than before. Around the same time, just past midnight, the man came back. This time, he went straight to the counter, his hat dripping water onto the floor. His face was still obscured, but I could see his mouth, thin and pale. "Gas," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, ringing up the sale. "Which pump?" "No pump," he replied. "Just gas." I stared at him, confused. "You mean a gas can?" He didn't answer, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, sliding it across the counter. His hand was ice cold when it brushed mine, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. He left without taking anything, and once again, there were no footprints leading away from the store. The puddle on the floor was the only evidence he'd been there at all. That night, the power went out completely. The storm knocked out the generator, plunging the station into darkness. I lit a few candles and huddled behind the counter, the howling wind outside masking every other sound. It was then that I noticed the smell, strong and acrid, like gasoline. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air until I could taste it. My stomach churned, and I grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source. When I stepped into the back room, the light flickered and died. In the pitch black, I heard it, the sound of boots on the floor, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm outside. Then, from the shadows, came a voice. "You should leave." It was the man, but his voice was different now, deeper, almost guttural. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight, finally managing to turn it on. The beam swept across the room, but it was empty. The smell of gasoline grew stronger, and I stumbled back toward the front of the store. The candles had gone out, leaving the room in darkness. I turned the flashlight toward the counter and froze. The man was standing there, his hat tilted back just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light. His mouth twisted into a grin, and he raised a hand, his fingers dripping with a dark, oily liquid. "You should leave," he said again, and then he vanished. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I grabbed my keys and ran, the storm soaking me to the bone as I jumped into my car. I didn't stop driving until I was home, locking every door and window behind me. The gas station burned down that night. The fire department said it was an accident, that a lightning strike had ignited a fuel leak. But I knew better. I never told anyone about the man or what I saw, but sometimes, on stormy nights, I think I catch a glimpse of him in the shadows. A dark figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, waiting for the next fool who doesn't heed his warning. Whispering Creek was one of those small towns you'd think existed only in postcards. Rolling hills, quaint streets, and a population that never seemed to change. Growing up, I always felt safe there, surrounded by familiar faces and places. But what happened to me this summer before I left for college changed the way I viewed my hometown forever. I worked part-time at Whispering Creek General Store, a small, family-owned shop that doubled as the local gossip hub. My shifts were usually uneventful, spent stacking shelves and chatting with Mrs. McLean, the store owner. But one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, a man I'd never seen before walked in. He was tall and wiry, with sunken eyes and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. His clothes were dusty and torn, as if he'd been wandering for days. He didn't say a word, just browsed the aisles while I kept an uneasy watch from behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. He stopped, turned toward me, and smiled. A wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "No," he said, "just looking." The man didn't buy anything. He just lingered, his eyes scanning the store as if he were memorizing every detail. Then, without another word, he walked out, the door's chime echoing in the stillness. Who was that? I asked Mrs. McLean when she returned from the stockroom. Her face paled. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling, "but I've seen him before." She wouldn't say more, and I didn't press her. But that night, as I walked home through the winding streets of Whispering Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed darker, the quiet more oppressive, and every creak of the wooden fences made me jump. The next day, news spread through town like wildfire. Old Man Fletcher, who lived alone at the edge of the woods, had disappeared. His house was untouched, his car still in the driveway, but there was no sign of him anywhere. "He didn't just leave," Mrs. McLean said when I mentioned it at work. "No one leaves Whispering Creek like that." I thought about the man from the store, his piercing eyes and unsettling grin. Could he have been involved? I tried to dismiss the thought. It seemed too far-fetched, but the feeling of unease lingered. A week later, I saw him again. I was closing up the store when I noticed him standing across the street, partially hidden by the shadows of an old oak tree. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there watching. My heart raced as I locked the door and hurried down the street, the sound of my footsteps too loud in the silence. When I reached home, I locked every door and window, my hands shaking. But as I looked out my bedroom window, I saw him again, standing at the end of the street. This time, he raised his hand and waved. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the store's door. It was written in messy, uneven letters that seemed to crawl across the page. "Stay out of the woods." I showed the note to Mrs. McLean, but she just shook her head, her face grim. "The woods aren't safe," she said. Not since the old days." "What old days?" I pressed. She hesitated, then finally spoke. "There are stories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about people going into the woods and never coming out, about shadows that move when they shouldn't. The town doesn't talk about it anymore, but some of us remember." That night, curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way to the woods at the edge of town. The air was thick and humid, the trees casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. As I ventured deeper, the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Then I saw it, a small clearing illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. In the center stood a figure, hunched and still, its back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the man from the store. "Who are you?" I called, my voice trembling. He turned slowly, his face obscured by the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "They don't like visitors." "Who?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the trees behind me. I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. But then I saw them. Shadows moving against the trees, too fast and fluid to be human. They grew closer, their forms shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. "Run," the man said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted back the way I came, the shadows closing in around me. The trees seemed to twist and shift, their branches clawing at me as I ran. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The man was never seen again, and neither was Old Man Fletcher. The woods returned to their usual stillness, but the whispers remained. Stories of shadows and disappearances, of a darkness that lingered just out of sight. I left Whispering Creek the following year, but the memories stayed with me. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, calling me back to the woods. And I wonder if I'd ever make it out a second time. In my small town of Silver Pines, there's a place everyone avoids, the old railroad tracks that cut through the outskirts. They haven't been used in decades, but the rails remain, rusting in the tall grass. The tracks are a relic of the town's industrial past, but they're better known for the stories, the ones about people who walked the tracks and never came back. Growing up, my parents always told me to stay away from them. "It's dangerous," they'd say, their voices tinged with a fear they wouldn't explain. But when you're a teenager, danger has a way of drawing you in. My friends Marcus, Ellie, and I were no exception. It was a Friday night in late September when we decided to see the tracks for ourselves. Ellie had heard rumors about strange lights and ghostly figures, and Marcus was eager to prove them wrong. I went along reluctantly, my curiosity battling the unease I felt. The tracks were just outside of town, a 15-minute walk past the old mill. By the time we reached them, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air was thick with the earthy smell of damp grass. The rails stretched into the darkness, their rusty surfaces gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "This is it," Marcus said, kicking at a loose rail spike. "Not exactly terrifying." Ellie shushed him, her flashlight darting along the tracks. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I heard it too, a faint humming, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere down the line. It was the kind of sound that gets under your skin, making your hair stand on end. "Probably just the wind," Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced. We followed the tracks, the humming growing louder with every step. The air grew colder, and the night seemed unnaturally quiet, as though the forest around us was holding its breath. Then we saw the light. It was faint at first, a flickering glow far down the tracks. As we approached, it grew brighter, shifting and pulsing like firelight. Ellie's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving us with only the eerie glow to guide us. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Let's find out," Marcus said, already moving ahead. The light led us to an old rail car, its metal sides covered in rust and graffiti. It sat abandoned on the tracks, its windows dark and broken. The humming was louder now, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. Ellie hesitated. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her face pale. But Marcus ignored her, climbing onto the car's rusted platform. "It's just an old train," he said. "What's the big deal?" He pushed open the door, and the humming stopped. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The floor was littered with debris, old newspapers, broken bottles, and bits of wood. But what caught my attention were the markings on the walls. Symbols, carved deep into the metal, jagged and crude. They looked like letters, but not from any language I recognized. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, almost alive. "What the hell is this?" Marcus asked, running his hand over one of the carvings. Ellie backed toward the door. "We need to leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the car. The light outside disappeared, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our flashlights. When mine flickered on, it revealed something that made my stomach drop. The carvings were glowing faintly now, their light casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air grew colder, and a faint whispering filled the space, low and unintelligible. "Open the door," Ellie screamed, pounding on the metal. Marcus and I joined her, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, forming words we couldn't understand. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding us like a suffocating presence. Then the car moved. It started with a jolt, sending us sprawling to the floor. The rail car creaked and groaned as it began to roll down the tracks, picking up speed despite the lack of an engine. The whispering turned into a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the other in a chaotic, inhuman cacophony. I crawled to the window, trying to see where we were going, but the outside world was a blur. The forest whipped past in streaks of darkness, and the glow from the carvings bathed the interior in an otherworldly light. Marcus grabbed my arm, his face pale with terror. "We have to jump." The car's speed was increasing, the walls rattling as if they would collapse at any moment. Ellie was sobbing, clutching the door as though it might save her. I hesitated for a moment, but Marcus didn't wait. He flung open one of the side panels and leaped into the darkness. "Ellie, come on," I shouted. She shook her head, too terrified to move. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the opening, the air rushing past us like a gale. Together, we jumped, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the tall grass. When I looked back, the car was gone. The tracks were empty, the humming and whispering replaced by the quiet of the night. Marcus was lying a few feet away, clutching his arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. Ellie was shaking, her face streaked with tears. We limped back to town in silence, too shaken to speak. When we told the sheriff what had happened, he dismissed it as a prank or a dream brought on by fear. But I knew better. The old rail car wasn't just abandoned. It was something else entirely, and whatever was inside it wasn't meant to be found. In the heart of my small town of Willow's End stood a house no one dared approach. It was an old Victorian, its paint peeling and its windows shattered. Over the years, stories about the house had grown into local legend. Some said it was cursed, while others claimed it was haunted by the ghost of its last owner, a recluse named Mrs. Evelyn Stark. The truth? No one really knew. The house had stood empty for decades, and most people avoided it, preferring to keep their distance from its ominous shadow. But for three bored teenagers on a cool October night, it seemed like the perfect place to explore. My friends, Mia and Jonah, and I were hanging out at the park when Jonah suggested it. "Come on," he said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "It's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" Mia hesitated, her brow furrowed. "People say bad things happen there. You've heard the stories." "They're just stories," Jonah scoffed. "Besides, don't you want to know what's inside?" I wasn't sure why I agreed. Maybe it was Jonah's confidence, or maybe it was the strange pull I felt every time I passed the house. Whatever the reason, an hour later, we were standing at the rusted gate, staring up at the looming silhouette of the Stark house. The air was colder near the house, and the faint smell of mildew and rot hung in the air. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the once grand porch sagged under years of neglect. Jonah pushed open the gate, the hinges groaning in protest, and we stepped onto the cracked stone path. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. Mia hesitated. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "It's fine," Jonah said, stepping inside. "See? Nothing to worry about." I followed reluctantly, Mia close behind. The interior of the house was even more unsettling than I'd imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light from our flashlights barely penetrated the shadows. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and old, broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. As we moved deeper into the house, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like the air itself was pushing against me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under our feet. "This place is a dump," Jonah said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "It feels wrong," Mia whispered, "like we're not supposed to be here." Before I could respond, we heard it, a faint whisper, coming from upstairs. We froze, our flashlights darting toward the staircase. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices blending into an unintelligible hum. Jonah grinned nervously. "It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had fallen upstairs. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's go," she said urgently. But Jonah was already heading for the stairs. "We came here to see what's inside, didn't we?" Reluctantly, Mia and I followed, the stairs groaning under our weight. The upper floor was even darker, the narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, and the pressure in my chest grew stronger. We reached the end of the hall, where a single door stood ajar. A faint light spilled through the crack, flickering like candlelight. Jonah pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a large mirror hanging on the far wall. The light we'd seen was coming from it, a soft, unnatural glow that seemed to ripple across its surface. The air in the room was ice cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Jonah approached the mirror, his reflection distorted and twisted in the flickering light. "What is this?" he asked, reaching out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the glow intensified, flooding the room with blinding light. I shielded my eyes, and when I looked again, Jonah was gone. "Jonah!" Mia screamed, her voice echoing in the empty house. I ran to the mirror, but all I could see was my own reflection, pale and terrified. Jonah's voice came from somewhere inside it, faint and distant. "Help me," he said, his voice distorted. The glow faded, and the mirror returned to normal. Jonah's reflection was gone. Mia grabbed my arm. "We have to leave," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Now." I didn't argue. We ran back down the stairs and out of the house, the whispering following us every step of the way. When we reached the street, we collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. We told the police what happened, but they didn't believe us. They searched the house and found nothing. No glowing mirror, no sign of Jonah. His disappearance was ruled a runaway, but Mia and I knew the truth. The house had taken him. I left Willow's End a year later, but I never forgot that night. Sometimes I dream about the house, its dark windows staring at me like eyes. And sometimes I hear Jonah's voice, faint and distorted, calling for help. But I can't go back, because I know if I do, I'll never leave.